Today I'm going to show you how to write an integration test for an ASP.NET Core API. Now the API is defined in this controller, matches controller, which as you can see, it receives an instance of the GameMatcher object in the constructor because GameMatcher is the one that knows how to perform the actual game matching logic. And then down here, we have the actual endpoint that we want to test. The endpoint is known as a join match. It is a post endpoint. And all it does is that it receives a request, a join match request for a match. And then it will use the GameMatcher object to invoke the match player ID method. It sends that player ID and it will perform the actual game matching logic and it returns the actual match that was created or found for this player. And then it will go ahead and just transform that match into a game match response. Now we have already unit tested both match player async and two game match response in isolation, but now we want to have a test that verifies how this endpoint behaves when a real client sends a request, it lands in this controller action, and all the required components work together to complete the work and send back a successful response. And for that, the best thing that we can do is write an integration test. Now, two things to keep in mind is that this API requires authorization, as you can see here, and also this API requires a SQL Server database. We'll have to figure out a way to deal with both of those things as part of the integration test. So let's go ahead and create an integration test project over here. So let's create .NET new xunit, and the name is going to be matchmaker.api.integration tests. And we're going to be needing a few NuGet packages for our integration test. So let me clean this and let's switch into Matchmaker API integration test. So let's add .NET add package Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.MVC.testing. Okay, so this is the NuGet package that will allow us to stand up a full version of our application in memory. So that's super interesting. And then the other package is going to be .NET add package fluent assertions. So this is the one that's going to allow us to do our assertions in our integration test in a very nice and natural way. The other thing that we're going to be needing, of course, is a reference from the integration test into the actual API project. So we'll do .NET add reference into Matchmaker API, Matchmaker API.csprog. So now if we go back into our Explorer view on the left side, we're going to see that now we have our integration test project over there, right there, and then we even have our unitest1.cs class already predefined over here. But before we can start working in our integration test, there's something very important to figure out, which is how to bootstrap or stand up our application in memory for the purposes of the integration test. We want to do that automatically and not manually. So for that, what we can do is just create one type of class that is known as a web application factory. So let's go back into the Explorer view over here, and let's right click in the folder for integration test, new C# class, and this is going to be named Matchmaker Web Application Factory, like that. Okay, so let me collapse this and let's fix this very briefly, and let's clean up things a little bit. All right, so this class over here has to inherit from Web Application Factory, and the type that it has to use is actually program, which is the program class that is defined in your API project itself. And then for this to work, we're going to have to import the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.MVC testing namespace. Okay, and then we do have a bit of a problem here because program, if I do F12, program is, remember, is the startup, the bootstrapping code that you have in your API. This class is by default internal, right? So you cannot just access it from another project, right? That's not going to work. So for that to work, what we can do is the following. So let's go back to Explorer and let's go down into our Matchmaker.api project over here. And what you can do is just define in this project one more item group, right? So item group, and then in this item group, we're going to be defining just one new property, which is known as internals visible to. So internals visible to, and then this one over here is going to have just one element, which is going to be include, and that include has to be the name of your test project. All right, so the name of our test project, as you remember, if we go back over here and never mind this, is going to be matchmaker.api.integration test. So I'm just going to copy that name over here. Okay, and that will do it for this. So by doing this, you're saying that anything that's internal into this API project is going to be available or visible for our integration test. All right, so let's close this, and then if you go back here, you're going to see that we no longer have that squiggles on the program, so that's fine. But we still have a bit of a small problem here, which is about accessibility, because program is internal, right? And our class over here is public, so that's not going to work either. So there has to be a good match in there. So because of that, we're going to turn this class from public into internal, okay? And that's going to do it. Now, the next thing here, and before we start writing the code for this web application factory, is that we need to figure out a way for our integration test to get access to our SQL Server instance so that it can create the test database that we're going to be using. So for that, we're going to be defining a connection string for our integration test project, and I don't really like to write it directly into the code, so we're going to be using the secret manager to set up the connection string for this project. So for that, we're going to be just opening our terminal over here, and then I actually have a few lines for that in my README over here. You're going to see that this is how I actually stood up my SQL Server database. It's just a Docker container. And so down here, I'm going to be using this syntax over there to be able to define a user secret for my integration test so that we can actually connect from there into the SQL Server instance. So let's just follow what's in this README file. So down here, I'm going to be defining first the password for SA. So SA password is going to be the following. All right, and then I'm going to be defining the user secret to connect to the SQL Server database. Now, one very important thing here is that you don't want to be connecting to your real database, right? So you want to define a connection string to a test database. So this is the database that's going to be used only for testing purposes. So because of that, in this section here where we have the database right here, we're going to be modifying this so that it's not matchmaker, but in this case, it's going to be matchmaker test, for instance. You can use any other name. Just make sure that this is not the real name of your database. So I'm going to go ahead and just hit enter. And this error here happens because we have not initialized actually user secrets for this project. So to fix that, let's just go ahead and do .NET user secret init. And that's going to actually initialize that for this project. And then we go ahead and run again the previous command. And that's going to go ahead and set the user secret. As you can see, we now have a user secret defined for our integration test project. Right, so let's just close that and let's close this. And now the integration test project has a way to actually talk to the SQL Server instance. So it is time to define the code for our web application factory. So what we want to do now here is to override a method that's called configure web host. So this is the method that's going to be invoked automatically when the web application factory is standing up our ASP.NET Core application in memory. Now, what we want to do here is to somehow tell the web application factory that it has to use our test database as opposed to the real database when it stands up this application in memory, right? And to do that, what we can do is use builder.configure test services, right? So we are going to have to import Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.test host, and then we're going to open and close, and then we're going to be receiving services just like this. Okay, now configure test services is a very nice method that allows you to override the registration of services that was already performed in the application, because application is going to register all of the normal services in program that have been defined in program.cs, but now we want to override some of them. So let's start with the following. We're going to be doing services.remove all, which by the way is a method that you can use to remove all of the instances of one of the types that have been registered in the dependency injection container. And for this, we're going to be using Microsoft.extensions.dependency-injection.extensions. All right, so we're going to be removing all, and this is going to be for all of the instances of the DB context options objects for the DB context that our application uses. So in this case, it's going to be DB context options, and then it's going to be of type matchmaker DB context. So for this, we're going to need to import using Microsoft.Entity Framework Core, and also for our DB context, we need using matchmaker.api.data. Okay, so by doing this, what we're doing is pretty much saying, hey, forget about the connection string and all of the other database options defined for the real application, and let me go ahead and define a new set of options for the database, specifically the connection string, right? So after doing this, of course, what we want to do now is to somehow retrieve that connection string that we defined as a user setting for our integration test project. So for that, I have already prepared a bit of a helper method here so you don't see me typing so much. So let me just paste that over here. So this method is called getConnectionString. And let me go ahead and import what's missing here. So using Microsoft extensions and configuration, right? So the idea of this method is that we go ahead and build this configuration builder object, and then we go ahead and add the user settings for our current class. And this line here is the one that's going to read that connection string that we set into the secret manager into user secrets. So this is going to read that, and then we prepare this configuration object from which we can go ahead and actually retrieve that matchmaker connection string, which is for our test database, not for the real database, but only for the test database. All right, and then we just return that connection string. So with that method handy there, what we can do is the following. We can just say var constring equals get connection string, and then we can go ahead and just like we did for the real application, we can go ahead and add our DB context with SQL Server. So we're going to say services.add SQL Server. Okay, and then for this, let's use Microsoft extensions that dependency injection, and this is going to be for matchmaker DB context. Okay, and then of course here we're going to be passing in our const string. All right, just like this. Okay, so this is going to take care of adding a brand new DB context for our test purposes. And then the last thing that we want to do here is to also have a way to start clean, because remember that we may potentially have multiple integration tests here. I want to make sure that we start with a clean database on every single run. And for that, the way that I like to do that is to delete any existing database every time we run this logic over here. So for that, let's do the following. First, let me just bring in another piece of a helper method that I prepared. So let me copy that down here. Which is actually the same logic that we use in the real application. We're going to do something similar, but in this case, we're going to be first building the service provider because we don't have an instance just yet, but we created via the services collection over there, create the scope, and then we go ahead and get the DB context required service over there. And so now that we have the DB context, we can now go back over here into configure test services, and we can do the following. Okay, so we can say var DB context equals create DB context, just like it says there, and then we're going to say DB context dot database dot ensure deleted. Okay, this method over here is going to make sure that it deletes the database if it exists already, so that we can start clean. And whenever the application starts, it's going to go ahead and run the migrations, and by doing that, it's going to recreate the database right away. And so, yeah, so that's pretty much what we need from the web application factory at this point. And so what we want to do now is to actually, we'll go ahead and write the actual integration test. So let's go back into Explorer over here, and let's go into our unit test 1 class over here, which we're going to be renaming actually into matches controller tests, right? Because these are the tests for the matches controller. So let me collapse this. Let's rename that. Okay. And then the name for this method is going to be join match request adds player to match, right? It's a very simple test. We just want to see if we can actually add the player to a match when we invoke the join match endpoint. Okay, this is going to be an async task method over there. And then let's go ahead and define our sections, arrange, act, and assert. So in the arrange phase, of course, what we want to do is to stand up our web application factory. So let me just take that. Let's call this one just application, right? So we create application factory, and that's going to go ahead and bootstrap the application in memory. And then what we're going to do is just to define our request. So it's going to be a join match request, and then we'll have to import matchmaker.api.contracts.dtos. Okay, so this is going to be our request, and let's say that this is going to be for our, it's going to be just P1, that's our player 1. So let's keep going down here, and then the next thing we're going to do is to prepare the actual client. We need an HTTP client to talk to our API, right? Like any real client would do. So we're going to do client equals application.create client. So that's kind of the preparation. So now we have an actual HTTP client. You're going to see this is a real HTTP client. And so now what I want to do is to send that request. So all we have to do, as actually this is being suggested, is this line here. So we're going to say client.post as JSON async. And let me see if we're missing something here, using system.net.http.json. Okay, so we're making a call into API matches, which is our endpoint, with the request that we prepared. And after doing that, we're going to do our assertions here. So first thing we're going to assert is that we get a successful status code. So it has to be somewhere between 200 or 299. That will be a success. And then we can do a few more things, like for instance, we can go ahead and read the response, right? And let's call this one match response. Okay, we're going to read that response, and then we can verify a few things. For instance, we can say that match response, let's say that the ID should, in this case, it would be should be positive, right? Because the API should be able to assign an ID to that match. Now let me import here fluent assertions we are missing right now, and also we're going to just do this, right? So we should make sure, I mean, that is going to make sure that it is not null, and then the ID that we receive is positive. So we should be database should be auto assigning that ID over there. The next thing is that player one, the player one property should be P1, because we declared that we're going to be using P1 like right there. Okay, and then lastly, perhaps we also want to verify the state of the match. So we can say match response, that state should be name of game match state that waiting for opponent. And let me just grab that matchmaker.api entities. Okay, so by doing this, we're verifying that really we're pretty much receiving what we expect to receive from the API. So with that in place, we're pretty much ready to go ahead and run this test. So what I'm going to do is just click on run test over here. All right, and let's see what we get. Okay, and so we actually got a failing test over here. As you can see right here, this is a failing test. And if we scroll down a little bit, you're going to see the following. So right here, it says response status code does not indicate success, is a 401 unauthorized. And this is actually expected because if you remember, if we go back into our controller, we do require authorization. And we have not done really anything just yet to handle that. So we need to somehow account for that. So let's see what we can do. Let's go back into our Explorer. And what we want to do at this point is to create what is known as an authentication handler. So this is a type of class that you can use to somehow simulate the authentication requirements for your API, right? So to let the test go into the API. So let me also right click here, and I'm going to say new C# class, and this is going to be named test auth handler. Okay, let's collapse this, and let's fix this, and let's fix that, right? So our test auth handler has to inherit from authentication handler. Okay, and let's see, we have to import something, Microsoft ASP.NET Core authentication, and then you also want to use here the type of authentication scheme options. Now let's do a control dot here, and let's go ahead and generate our constructor, and let's also do a control dot to implement this abstract class like that. Okay, and so yeah, constructor is auto-implemented, a little bit verbose, but we're not going to care too much about that. The focus is on this handle authentication async method over here. So here we have to somehow figure out a way to authenticate the request that's going to be coming in. And we're going to just simulate a bunch of things to move forward. So first thing we're going to need is an identity. So it's going to be a new claims identity. Okay, and then for this one, let's use system.security.claims, and then we don't need any claims here, so we're going to say array.empty, and there's going to be claim. So it's an empty array of claims, and then we do need to provide some names, so let's provide the name of just test over there. Okay, and with that claim identity, we can now go ahead and craft our principal, the principal object as it says over there, and with that, we can go ahead and create our authentication ticket. Now, when we create this authentication ticket, we have to specify what's going to be the scheme for which we're creating this ticket. So in this case, let's just name this one test scheme. Finally, when we have the ticket ready, we can actually go ahead and prepare the result that we're going to be returning, which is going to be a successful result with the ticket that has been prepared. And of course, now we have to just return, since this is an async method, we have to say task.fromResult, and then we return that result over there. Okay, and yeah, that's pretty much all you have to do to prepare your handler that's going to be executed anytime we need to satisfy this authentication requirement for the integration test. So now that we have ready this class, we have to figure out how to use it in the web application factory. So let's go back to Matchmaker Web Application Factory, and really all we have to do is the following. So I'm going to do this just before the creation of our DB context, and we're going to do services.add-authentication with the scheme that we prepared. So the scheme is test scheme, so you have to use that same scheme. So let's copy that over here, so test scheme, and then we have to say add scheme as it says over here with authentication scheme options. I'm going to have to import Microsoft ASP.NET Core authentication over here, and then let me just send this to the next line, we can see better. Okay, we're going to be saying again test scheme over here, and then we just an empty set of objects over there. Notice that here is where we're using our test authentication handler right here, right? And so whenever any request comes in and requires authentication, then the handler is going to be executed to satisfy the requirements. And so with that, we should be pretty much ready to go ahead and execute our test, which is defined over here, matchmaker controller tests. And then let's go ahead and click on run test and see what we get this time. And so as you can see, we now got a passing test right here. It was all good. And so the test was able to actually execute send a request into the API all the way to the database and perform what it had to do. Now you may want to confirm that our integration test is actually going into the API and actually deleting and creating that database as we have prepared in the test, right? So for that, let's try to do a debugging session and see if this is working as expected. So for that, first let's take a quick look at the database. So let me show my activity bar on the left side, and let me switch into my SQL Server over here. So as you can see, I have right now, and I'm going to refresh this very quickly, refresh. And so we have the real database matchmaker and our matchmaker test database right there. Okay, and so as we go into the test, we're going to see how this database disappears and is created once again by the tests. Okay, and so now let's also go ahead and put some breakpoints. So I'm going to put a breakpoint perhaps inside the web application factory, and then right here, which is where we're going to be deleting that database. Okay, I'm going to go into matchmaker controller test, and also let's put a breakpoint over here before we invoke the endpoint. And then let's also go down into our controller, right, which is where we're going to be receiving the request over here. We should be able to hit that. Let's close this, and let's go into matchmaker controller tests, and let's go ahead and start a debugging session. So let's click on debug test, and let's see what we get. And one more thing that we can do, I mean, even actually before we keep going, is actually we can go into our data and then data extensions, which is where we have the method that actually performs a migration over here. So that's the one that's going to be creating the actual database. Okay, so let's go back to matchmaker web application factory. So we are inside our configure web host and configure the services. We have done all of this code over here, and now we're going to go ahead and delete the database, right? Remember that we have the database defined over here. And so I'm going to go over this line. And if we just refresh this, you're going to see that the database is gone, right? The test database is completely gone, right? Which is expected. And now we're going to just keep going. So keep going. And then now we are into the request pipeline for the actual API, right? We have invoked the initialize DB async method in the actual API. And then we're going to do the migration via this method over here. We're going to step over. Okay, may take a second. And if we go back into SQL Server over here and we refresh this, you're going to see that the database is back, right? It's matchmaker tests, and it actually has the matches table over there with all the required columns, right? It's all there, and the migrations and all that is in place. So now we go ahead and we just hit and continue. Okay, and as you can see, now we are in the actual test. Now we are in the test, the application factory has been created, the client has been created, and we are going to be sending the post request over there with our request for player one. And I'm going to also place a breakpoint over here, and then I'm going to keep going. And as you can see, now we are inside the join match method in the controller itself, right? And I'm going to do F11 to go into the matcher. So here's the matchmaker logic that we have in there. Okay, we're going to use the repository to see if there's a match. So now we are in the repository, the entity framework game match repository. And here we're going to go ahead and use the DB context to see if there is an actual match. So we keep going. It says that match is null, so it's going to keep going across the logic. But the important thing is that we have actually gone all the way down into the database, right? So I'm going to go ahead and click on continue. So we go back into the test, right? So now we're back in the test. We're going to ensure that there's a successful status code, which succeeded, and then we should be able to verify that everything is as expected. So this is, we have an ID, we have a player one, and then the state is as expected waiting for opponent. So we click continue, and then the test has passed as expected. So there you go, a fully working integration test for your API controller. And if you like this video, please check out this other video that will going to have another very interesting tip on .NET and ASP.NET Core. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.